Okay, I think this is the last video. Yay, right? So I do want to reinforce the fact that I'm not going to ask you about varicosity. So what I'm going to look for in smooth muscle or the pace setter cells. I mean, so I include more than is going to be necessary for you to retain, in other words, right? We just want to know in general, again, that smooth muscle is involuntary. It's got a different arrangement, has a single nucleus, is spindle-shaped, is a very slow to contract, doesn't tend to fatigue readily. So, and it can again be triggered by, its contractions can be triggered by a variety of hormones as well as norepinephrine and acetylcholine, right? So this information is also something I really don't see writing a test question on. It's more informational about smooth muscle. We see it organized into single units, and again here I say importantly, it varies with your need, or a multi-unit, okay? So, and single units are the most common. It's basically a sheet of cell. So it acts like really the cardiac muscle does. It works as one, right? So all those myocytes in your cardiac work as one cell, really, when it comes right down to it, that's an organ, right? So smooth muscle has this capability as well. And again, this is the most common way it works. So we've got these gap junctions again to spread electricity quickly, and these cells, basically, it's all for one, right? And so again, in this case, the sarcomeres are not constrained. The fibers are not constrained by the limits of the sarcomere. So as we see stretch in a tube or an organ, as it fills, this causes contraction and then relaxation. So we have this rhythmic contractions that get set up according to this. So these single units are found, the sheets of smooth muscle cells, found in the walls of hollow organs, and so they're commonly also known as a visceral, right? The multi-unit are not as well organized. They work individually, kind of like the motor units, and they can be independent of their neighbors, again, like the motor units in skeletal muscle. They contract only after stimulated by a motor neuron, again, very much like skeletal muscle. But they can be also stimulated by hormones, but not stretch, so different from the single unit. We find this again in the walls of large blood vessels, the respiratory airways, and the irises of your eyes. All right. Again, you can read about the regeneration of muscle proteins by satellite cells and periocytes. It's pretty cool, right, on page 436. But that's also, again, not something I'm going to test you over. All right. So here. This is actually some stuff from McGraw-Hill on the rest of this. So it's just basically figures, and I'm going to leave this for your ability. I'm just not going to talk about all of it. So this part of the PowerPoint is really introducing the muscles that you're looking at in lab. And so I say, what muscles do is understood in the context of their movement, right? And they are levers. Some of you pointed that out in some of the pre-labs. And so, levers have these basic components, all right? We've already talked about force and resistance would, of course, be the weight or whatever it is, the mass you were moving, right? And the force is generated by the muscle, all right? So I am not, again, going to ask you to determine this for the different muscles, all right? So this is also just a kind of, for your information, muscles work like levers, and they have these components that lever systems have, right? And so it's just not that important to understanding the basic way muscles work, honestly. So that's, again, why I'm not going to test on it. So origins and insertions I will test on, right? Most muscles, I said in lab, extend from one bone to another bone, crossing joints, and movement occurs when the muscle contracts and shortens, and the shortening moves the bones. So in the muscles we're looking at in lab, we talk about origin and insertion, these attachment points of the muscle to bone. The origin or head is the one that's most likely not to move, though it can, right? And it usually is proximal, so closer to a point of attachment, or medial, right, to the insertion. So just to let you know, there's some rules here, as I tried to explain in lab. You can have multiple heads, and we reflect that when we use terms like biceps and triceps. Insertion, right, is the end that is most likely going to do the movement. So we asked you guys to know origins and insertions so you understood the actions of the muscles, all right? So This is not something, again, I'm probably going to test on. It's just terminology when we talk about muscles. They work as groups, right? So we're not really emphasizing that much in lab. We don't take that opportunity, but the reality is they do. You know, you have a whole group of muscles that does the flexion of the forearm. It's not just the biceps brachii, right? So again, this allows us to have coordinated movement, so smooth and rhythmic, not looking like we're jerking and right, again, unplanned movement. Muscles tend to be grouped as, right, agonists and antagonists. And there's also a group we call the synergist. So a synergist is somebody who joins in to help you, right? So they make the action of the agonist more effective. So they provide assistance, all right? The agonist is usually the one doing the movement, all right? So, and again, the synergist is just helping. Sometimes they're just stabilizing a joint or something of that nature. An antagonist is a muscle that moves, that opposes the agonist movement, right? If you antagonize something, you oppose it. And so it restores. So remember how we talked about movements as flexion and extension, medial rotation and lateral rotation, supination and pronation and plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So these are basically opposite movements, and so opposite muscles do this. Abduction and adduction. And so again, it turns out that what you see is that the muscles tend to be on opposite placements in the body, so they can perform opposite movements. So do look for that when I ask you about location. I mentioned this in lab. I said, you know, your muscles are named by their shape, their location, right? So we looked at trapezius in lab. We're going to look at deltoids, we look at rhomboids, right? Location, like pectoralis, right? Frontalis. Origins, insertions, and this is the one that Abby liked, right? The sternocleidomastoid, right? Number of origins, we haven't gotten to any yet, but that'll be the biceps and triceps, and we have a couple of those. Size, you're going to see a number of them called vastus, vast, big, right? And then there's majors and minors. Function, so you have flexors and extensors, and you have supinators and pronators, and you have adductors, all right? And I said oftentimes it is a combination of these, all right? Now, so the rest of these slides, again, are just pictures to go along with what we talked about in lab. And they're grouped again by muscles of head and neck. Here's our facial expression, mastication, right? Pectoral girdle. There we go, right? And here I've also done the anterior, posterior, right? Arm movement. We didn't get into this in lab this week, but during week 9 we will in week 10. And again, if you're moving the arm, you're going to have to attach to the humerus, right? And that'll be your insertion, right? So if you're moving the arm, your insertion will be on the humerus, right? So you see this all the way down, right? Humerus, humerus, humerus. And then your origin is going to be somewhere stabilizing on the pectoral girdle or the ribs or even the vertebral column, right? These are, again, we'll look at the infraspinatus, the terse minor. We don't look at the subscapularis, but these are all things that help, right, move. They really stabilize and help the arm, right? Anterior are your flexors, as I mentioned, like the pectoralis major. Posterior are the extensors, like the latissimus dorsi and the tierce major. They'll work together. The major is the lowest one here, and of course the latissimus dorsi is this one right here, right? So abductors, yeah, the deltoid and the supraspinatus work together, so we want to pair them together. Forearm movement, we only really look at the biceps and triceps, but there are a number of other ones. Again, the flexors are in the front, anterior. The extensors are posterior. And this goes through, and again, I've italicized the ones that you're not going to be tested on in lab or lecture. Wrist and finger movement, again, we don't cover any of these in lab, but I do tell you again, anterior muscles generally flex, and look at that, the names of all these. So if you ever do have to learn them, it's pretty straightforward, right? So posterior are extensors, and look at that, all of them have extensor in their name, all right? Abdominal wall muscles, this is where we ended with lab this week. So they basically compress the abdominal cavity. They can do flexion of the vertebral column. So this is going through some of the features or landmarks that are used to kind of organize these, because you have to have some reinforcement, again, because there's not bone in this area. Compression, again, external abdominal obliques, internal abdominal obliques, transversus abdominis, and rectus abdominis. These were the 4. And this kind of takes it apart to show you layer by layer where we're going here. All right, and that's kind of nice where they've cut in to show. So you have about 4 layers, and this really strengthens and reinforces that abdominal wall. All right, none of these are going to be covered for the pelvis. We go into the thigh, and so we don't know all of these for lab, but there are quite a few. So if you're going to move the thigh, again, you're going to have an insertion on, yes, the femur. So here we go, femur, femur, fascia of the thigh, femur, 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 right, iliotibial tract, we'll cover that one. Femur, right, femur, 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 right, and then finally with the gracilis, it's actually the tibia, but, right, so, and then the origin is probably going to be somewhere on the pelvic girdle, lots of lovely landmarks on that girdle to help us with that. They, again, separated into anterior that are flexors of the thigh and posteriors that are extenders. The posterior ones also abduct and rotate it, all right. You will need to know the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, and the tensor fascia. Alright, so these are posterior / lateral, so gluteus maximus is your butt, right, so it's really posterior. Alright, the gluteus medius is really this kind of fan shape just underneath it. So again, slightly smaller muscle, that's why it's medius and not maximus, right? And then the tensor fascia is this great muscle right here. It really looks considerably small compared to its tendon, which is very long, this iliotibial, right, from the ilium to the tibia tract, right? So, and the tensor fascia and the gluteus medius really do the same, right? They abduct and kind of medially rotate the thigh. Whereas the gluteus maximus, this is a huge extender of the hip. And it does the opposite, it laterally rotates. All right, thigh adductors are all medial, yeah, because you're moving it back towards the midline. Yeah, they're going to have to be there. So we have 2 of them named adductors, longus and magnus, so this doesn't really help us separate them, but yeah. And then between them is actually this very thin, and gracilis means slender, muscle called the gracilis. And so it turns out the longus is more anterior to the magnus, and so it has a origin on the pubis, while the magnus has an origin on the ischium. Okay, so they also can flex thigh, and they do a few other things, but I always remember, yeah, they adduct. They're named for that. The muscles that move your leg, all right, so these are in the thigh, and they would have an insertion somewhere tibia, over the patella, right, or fibula, right, so head of fibula here, tibia, 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 right? Patella to the tibial tuberosity, okay? So insertions, if we're going to move the leg, have to be somewhere on the tibia or fibula, right? So now we have an opposite though, okay? So while the anterior ones, collectively called the quadriceps femoris, so right, femur, and there's 4 of them, right? And you need to know them: rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. I wonder where they are, right? Flex the hip, but they also extend the knee. So that's why we have this opposite coloration. The posterior are collectively called the hamstrings, and you'll need to know the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. And they extend the hip, but they also flex the knee. So now we see, I said below the knee, we switch. Flexors are posterior and extenders are anterior. In the middle of all this is the sartorius, and it's the longest muscle in the body. We mentioned this previously, and it does a variety of functions. It's really for crossing your legs. It's also called the Taylor's muscle. All right, so this of course goes through all of them and the groupings of them. All right, with the extensors, right, of the leg again, and the quadriceps femoris. All right, ankle and toe movements, we really only look at 2 of them, and that's the gastrocnemius and the soleus. And they work together, and they are both posterior, and they are both able to do plantar flexion of the foot. Right, so they have their insertion, yes, on the calcaneus, right, since it's moving the foot. All right, and that really takes us through everything we need to know about muscle. Whew. I hope this helps. Please let me know if there's anything that's confusing, and there probably will be, so don't be shy.